Some movies do badly, and it's a knock on the studio. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, The Marvels, and Wish were all knocks on Disney. Black Adam, Shazam, Fury of the Gods, The Flash, and Blue Beetle were all knocks on Warner Brothers, though to be fair, Blue Beetle was facing some strong headwinds. Babylon, Dungeons & Dragons, Honor Among Thieves, and Mission Impossible, Dead Reckoning Part 1 were all knocks on Paramount. But what none of those movies did was sink the studios that made them. That cannot be said for the movies I want to talk about, each of which all but destroyed the companies that financed them. Each of these movies were so expensive and they flopped so hard that the studios that fronted the cash had just three options. 1. Go bankrupt and shut down. 2. Sell the company off and lose independence. Or 3. In one rare case, hold on by the skin of their teeth. Each of these movies serve as a cautionary tale of what can happen when you spend too much money without knowing anything about your audience. A few of these were the result of an inflated ego, though, to be fair, most of these movies were also quite ambitious. Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within is a 2001 movie directed by Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of the Final Fantasy franchise. Development on it began in 1997 in the aftermath of the critical and commercial success of Final Fantasy VII, which was produced by Sakaguchi. It was Square's foray into feature film development, and it literally could not have been worse. But before we get to the problem, I want to talk about the positives, because The Spirits Within is an important, if not historic, movie. It represented a sea change in what was possible with animation and gave us a glimpse into the future. Before it, animated movies stayed in the realm of discernible animation. No one would mistake The Lion King, My Neighbor Totoro, Titan AE, or Toy Story for being realistic movies. The Spirits Within tried to push what an animated movie could be, though. It was the first serious, big-budget attempt at bringing photorealistic animation to the big screen for an extended time. Other movies like The Abyss, Terminator 2 Judgment Day, Jurassic Park, and The Matrix brought some measure of photorealistic CGI to movies, but all of them were mixed heavily with live-action elements. The Spirits Within did not rely on such crutches. Sakaguchi wanted a fully photorealistic animated movie, something that successors like Beowulf, The Adventures of Tintin, and The Polar Express would try to replicate to varying degrees of success. It wasn't until 2019's The Lion King from Disney that a photorealistic animated movie really broke through. But The Spirits Within was an ambitious project, if nothing else. Unfortunately, ambition does not come cheap, and that's where the issue lies. The Spirits Within was insanely expensive, coming in at a whopping $137 million. That included $30 million toward the marketing by Columbia, which was owned by Sony, who also handled the distribution. It also included a $45 million studio for Square in Hawaii. That sounds expensive, and it is, but Sakaguchi, who was hot off of Final Fantasy VII, had a lot of leeway. He brought in results after all, or at least he did. But that $137 million was way past the original $70 million budget that was planned. It's not hard to see why costs racked up though. The two product costs ate up $75 million on their own, and they hadn't even started working on the movie yet. The movie took 4 years to make. Of that, the first 18 months was spent writing software, while the remaining time was for the animation. And animation could be tedious. While motion capture was used for the most part, it wasn't perfect. Animators had to go in and fine-tune some of the animations or do them completely from scratch. According to John Edgar Park, writing for Animation World in 2001, quote, "The film itself is composed of 1,327 shots. There are 141,964 frames, each of which took anywhere from 15 minutes to over 7 hours per frame to render. The average was around 90 minutes. Square Pictures stored 10 terabytes of 3D and 5 terabytes of 2D artwork. The roughly 200 people who worked on the film contributed about 120 person-years of work." End quote. The animation was not perfect, and the motion capture does not look nearly as good as the contemporary Gollum from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The issue with photorealistic animation is the uncanny valley effect, or when something looks human but there's just something that's a little off about it that makes you feel icky. That problem has yet to be solved. The Spirits Within was not just inspired by the games, it was the most expensive movie to be inspired by or based on games at that point, which should clue you in as to how it did financially. After all, it wasn't until very recently that video game movies actually started making money at the box office. The movie made $85 million on its gigantic $137 million budget and was not well received either. But beyond that, the movie did significant damage to Square. It delayed the merger between them and Enix Corporation, forced the closure of Square Pictures, and dealt a significant financial blow to Square, who suffered their first financial loss since their foundation in 1986. Sakaguchi, who had plans for other movies, including an interactive one, eventually left Square and, after spending a few years in a demoralized state thanks to the negative impact of The Spirits Within, he founded his own game studio, Mistwalker. For all its issues, the movie is still historically important. Roger Ebert put it very well in his 3.5 out of 4-star review of the film. Quote, "In reviewing a movie like this, I am torn between its craft elements and its story. Final Fantasy is a technical milestone like the first talkies or 3D movies. You want to see it whether you care about aliens or space cannons. It exists in a category of its own, the first citizen of the new world of cyberfilm." End quote. Also, as an aside, Polygon has a phenomenal oral history about the making of Final Fantasy VII compiled by Matt Leone, which touches on the impact of The Spirits Within on the company from the people that worked at Square. It is, if nothing else, a tour de force piece of journalism and one of the best things you could ever read. I'll drop some links to it. Check it out, after finishing the video, of course. If you don't know Carolco Pictures, you know their movies. Terminator 2 Judgment Day, directed by James Cameron. Basic Instinct and Total Recall, directed by Paul Verhoeven. Universal Soldier and Stargate, directed by Roland Emmerich. And several movies in the Rambo franchise. The movie business has always been rough to upstarts, and that was no different for Carolco. Most of the movies that they made between 1976 and 1982 did not do well, but all you really need in this business is one big hit to get the ball rolling. That came in the form of 1982's First Blood, which the tiny company spent nearly $400,000 on to acquire the rights for, a decent risk. But the risk paid off and the company was on a roll from there. The success of First Blood and the sequel, the amusingly titled Rambo First Blood Part 2, helped define Carolco's focus on producing action movies for the next decade. They signed long-term contracts with Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger and used pre-sales to secure financing for their movies. That means that the distributor would invest in the movies and would get local releasing rights for them. It's a tried and true strategy, but it can also prove quite risky. And risk is the watchword when it comes to Carolco. A company that should have been run as a tight ship was, instead, acting more like a major film studio, spending cash quicker than it could come in. While it was true that they had many action movie successes, it was also true that they overspent to achieve those successes, handing over more than $10 million to stars like Stallone and Schwarzenegger. Worse, they had no backup to their action movies. They made plenty of small art house films, but those don't exactly rake in the big bucks. All the while, they were trying to acquire other companies and branch off into television production, acting like a mini-major when they were still solidly an independent. After that, a nasty legal battle that ensued when Carolco tried to acquire the rights to make James Cameron's as of yet unmade Spider-Man movie. All of this is to say that when Carolco decided to make 1995's Cutthroat Island, they were trying to make a Vegas-sized gamble. They let everything ride on one movie, and it was, perhaps, the dumbest move that they could make. The swashbuckling adventure film set during the golden age of piracy is notable for many things none of them could. 1. It has the distinct dishonor of being named as the biggest movie flop according to the Guinness Book of World Records. The movie cost $98 million to produce, though some reports peg it at $116 million. It made just $16 million globally, or $10 million in the US and $6 million internationally, an unqualified failure. While the Guinness record is outdated at this point, the inflation-adjusted amount would still translate to roughly a $200 million loss in 2024. Other movies have done worse in the intervening years, but that's cold comfort for Carolco. 2. It soured Hollywood on pirate-related movies for nearly a decade. Granted, this was not the 50s or 60s, where you might get as many as 10 pirate movies in a single year, but until Disney decided to take a well-founded risk on parts of the Caribbean in 2003, the genre was pretty dormant except for the usual Treasure Island adaptation and the start of One Piece. 3. It had a very troubled production, which is part of the reason that costs were so high. First, the company spent nearly $2 million to acquire the script and hired Rennie Harlin to direct it with a budget of $60 million. But the film kept running into issues. They couldn't find a lead actor, the script was being reworked without the director's input, filming kept getting delayed thanks to on-set incidents, and more. The endless wait proved too much for Carolco, which had to declare bankruptcy even before the movie was released because it was unable to make payments on its debt. Harlan would put in more than $1 million of his own money into the movie. He probably regretted the fact that he had some sets that were already built, torn down and rebuilt because they were made without his input. 4. Rennie Harlan cast his wife, Geena Davis, as the star of the movie. Now, Geena Davis is not a bad actress. Just a few years prior, she starred as Thelma in Ridley Scott's Thelma and Louise, as well as in A League of Their Own. But in casting Davis, Harlan increased her character's role in the film and reduced the time for the male lead. Michael Douglas, who was cast to play William Shaw, left the movie because he felt Harlan was favoring his wife. It was all for naught. The movie flopped hard and was the final nail in the coffin for Carolco, who had 2 other massive flops that same year. Last of the Dogmen, which made $7 million on a $25 million budget, and Showgirls, which did $38 million on a $45 million budget. Carolco would later sell its assets to French production and distribution house Studio Canal. Geena Davis and Rennie Harlan both suffered professional setbacks, though Davis's career has seen something of a resurgence in recent years. Without New Line Cinema, we would not have had Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy. Before New Line, Jackson was working with Miramax and the Weinstein brothers to bring his vision to the big screen. Jackson wanted 2 Lord of the Rings movies, while Harvey Weinstein wanted him to do the entire story in one. Then New Line founder Bob Shaye stepped in, told Jackson that they would finance the movie if he made it a trilogy, and one of the greatest filmic endeavors of the 20th century was underway. The movies brought in a lot of goodwill and money to New Line Cinema, who, less than half a decade after the release of The Return of the King, would be forced to merge itself into Warner Brothers in order to stay alive. The movie that forced that merger was 2007's The Golden Compass, which made $372 million on a budget of $180 million. Now, on the surface, you might be thinking, well, it made a profit, right? After all, it made more than double its budget. Unfortunately, New Line Cinema made an unwise decision near the beginning of production. In order to secure that $180 million budget, they had to sell off international rights to the movie. And, unfortunately for them, around $300 million of that $372 million came from the overseas box office, while only around $70 million came from the domestic box office. After eating a $110 million production loss, Time Warner, which owned New Line but kept it as its own separate entity, decided to fold it into Warner Brothers. This was not a sudden decision though. Unfortunately for New Line, after The Lord of the Rings, their fortunes took a dramatic downturn. First, they got into spats with Peter Jackson and the Tolkien estate over profit sharing from the movies. It's one of the more famous cases of Hollywood accounting. The gist is that you promise to share profits from a movie, but through creative, legal, and yet unethical means, make it seem as though a billion-dollar movie was somehow a loss. Jackson and the estate argued that they hadn't been paid for what they were due. 2. While New Line had a few hits like Hairspray, Fracture, and Final Destination 3, no other movie quite replicated the success of The Lord of the Rings, and a good chunk of their movies, with marketing factored in, failed to recoup their budget. Just a few months after The Golden Compass, Bob Shaye left the company that he founded in 1967. New Line still exists, but only as a part of Warner Brothers. Its legacy as an independent is all but over. It's unfortunate, as you can definitely see the $180 million on screen, and the movie won Best Visual Effects at the Academy Awards. But it also cost as much as 2 Lord of the Rings movies to make, and while the novel might be fine, it's no Lord of the Rings. One thing that you need to understand about Francis Ford Coppola is that the man is a true risk taker. In fact, he might be the last risk taker in Hollywood. Megalopolis is enough to prove that out. Sure, every movie is a risk, but they're usually made by massive studios that have billions of dollars at their disposal or have rich parent companies. Not Coppola and not American Zoetrope, the legendary film production house that he co-founded with George Lucas in 1969. The studio is still around today, though it has had its fair share of trials over the 5+ decades that it's been in business. Almost all of them were prompted by Coppola digging deep into his own pockets to come up with the money to see a movie to completion. Coppola was a risk taker from the start, using the studio to finance his project, The Rain People. Well, the movie bombed, and the second production, George Lucas's THX 1138, did not exactly set the world on fire. Coppola needed a job in order to keep the company afloat, and that job ended up being The Godfather. The deal he struck was phenomenal, a $125,000 salary and 6% of the gross, which amounted to more than $10 million when all was said and done. and thanks to the wild successes of American Graffiti, The Godfather Part 2, and Apocalypse Now, as well as a modest success in the form of The Conversation, things seem to be going well. Well, they were going well until they weren't. Except for Kagemusha, one of Akira Kurosawa's many masterpieces, no other movie that Coppola produced between 1980 and 1982 made any money. The capper was his 1982 $26 million musical boondoggle, One from the Heart, the movie that would bring him to the brink of collapse and force him to spend years trying to dig himself out of a financial pit. The movie was supposed to be financed by MGM, and the studio was willing to pay a hefty $2 million fee to Coppola to direct it. But the filmmakers of this era were a different breed of animal. They did not want to be beholden to the studios, at least until things were dire. While he accepted the offer from Paramount for The Godfather a decade before, Coppola made the, perhaps, foolish decision to do the project his way. That meant buying it from MGM and taking out loans a la Apocalypse Now. The big issue was that the movie's budget ballooned from $15 to $26 million. The issue was the same as the one that Michael Cimino faced on Heaven's Gate. Coppola wanted a lavish production, and lavish does not come cheap. Thanks to the failures of the previous years, Zoetrope was already struggling, and as the budget kept increasing, investors, including MGM, started pulling out. One man, Jack Singer, a wealthy Canadian real estate tycoon, would put $8 million into the movie and would not see any of it in return. The movie did not just do badly at the box office, it did horribly. It made less than $700,000 on its $26 million budget, in large part due to its inability to find a distributor. Distributors are important because they also handle the marketing for a movie, which means you need very deep pockets and very deep connections. Both of them ran very deep at MGM, but they already backed out. The next choice were his Godfather partners, Paramount, but they too backed out. Coppola secured Columbia Pictures at the last minute, but by then it was too late. The failure of One from the Heart would dog Coppola's footsteps for years. The movie led to not one, not two, but 3 bankruptcy proceedings in a decade. According to an LA Times article from 1992, quote, in 1983, Coppola filed for both personal bankruptcy and on behalf of one of his companies, Hollywood General Studios, end quote. Then, quote, the most recent filing was in January 1990 when Zoetrope Corporation and Zoetrope Productions listed debts of $28.9 million and assets of $22.2 million. 6 months later, a judge dismissed the case after Coppola worked out a plan to pay his debts, end quote. The third would happen July 1st, 1992. Each time, Coppola emerged with his company bruised but intact. Now, of course, he's bet more than $100 million on Megalopolis. The man does not know when to quit, which is, inarguably, his greatest trait and why he is, irrespective of box office or critical performance, one of the finest filmmakers of the last half-century. Francis Ford Coppola always walks the walk. Whenever people think of movies that destroyed studios, they're likely to think of Heaven's Gate. The movie, for all its flaws and issues, is historic for that reason alone. It was Michael Cimino's follow-up to The Deer Hunter, which, unlike Heaven's Gate, is considered one of the finest movies ever made. Heaven's Gate is, if nothing else, a testament to the ego of a singular individual who was given an inch and took so many miles that you can't even see him off in the distance. To put it in context, Cimino's original budget was $11 million. The final spend ended up being $44 million, or a full 4 times increase. All of that was in the service of sheer perfection. How perfect? To the point that Cimino reportedly halted production to wait for the right cloud to roll into the view. The unlucky studio that funded this boondoggle was United Artists, the legendary studio founded in 1919 by Hollywood's most powerful and luminous artists, Charlie Chaplin, D.W. Griffith, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks. To be fair, all of the blame cannot be laid at Michael Cimino's feet. The late 1970s and early 1980s were Hollywood's equivalent to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. From the 60s through the late 70s, the director was at the top of the pyramid in Hollywood, and men like Warren Beatty, Francis Ford Coppola, and, yes, Michael Cimino could command fantastic fees for their work. But with Jaws and Star Wars, Hollywood started getting attention from Wall Street, who saw the potential for billions. It had already begun in the late 60s with the purchase of UA by Transamerica Corporation. Soon, Sony, Coca-Cola, and even QVC wanted in on the action. The studios were now flush with cash from rich parent companies, and they spent it with a free hand. The directors took it and ran wild. This era of directors, growing up through the hippie revolution as they did not think very highly of the man who wanted to infringe on their art. But art without restraint is just waste. And Michael Cimino produced a lot of waste. The rumor on Heaven's Gate was that after just 6 days of filming in Montana, the production was 5 days behind schedule. Stephen Bach, who was an SVP at UA and who wrote Final Cut, which is arguably the definitive book on the production of Heaven's Gate, explained very succinctly why the movie cost so much. Cimino was, quote, building sets and rebuilding them, hiring 100 extras, then 200, then 500, adding horses and wagons and hats, shoes, gloves, dresses, top hats, bridles, boots, roller skates, babushkas, aprons, dusters, buckboards, gun belts, rifles, bullets, cows, calves, bulls, trees, thousands of tons of dirt, hundreds of miles of exposed film, end quote. He would take, quote, takes and retakes of the retakes, and retakes of those. Michael Cimino was taking and retaking time, end quote. And here are a few other things that Cimino did that did not make it into that quote. He had a street built, though it was a few feet off, and instead of building the rest of the set around it, he had it torn up and rebuilt a few feet away. In order to keep the grass green, he had a complete irrigation system installed. Some shots required 50 or more takes. A shoot that was just supposed to be a few months long ended up lasting 11 months. The result was an impossible to show 5.5-hour cut that he reduced to 3 hours and 39 minutes, and which would later be trimmed to 2 hours and 29 minutes. Neither of the cuts that were initially shown in theaters did well, and the movie pulled in a miserable $3.5 million against its $44 million outlay. UA suffered a major financial loss in 1980 thanks entirely to Heaven's Gate and an even more significant reputational loss. Transamerica later sold it off to Trescinda Corporation. Michael Cimino made more movies, but never recaptured the glory of the Deer Hunter. After Heaven's Gate, the movie studios would begin to reassert their power, and it would remain that way until the independent 90s. The main culprit in some of these cases is a large budget that then gets inflated because costs keep going up for whatever reason. Sometimes that whatever reason is a perfectionist or, if you prefer, egotistical director. Were Heaven's Gate, One from the Heart, and Cutthroat Island to be directed by someone else, they might not have been so expensive. The same issue plagues studios now. Budgets are wildly inflated, and unless studios are able to get costs under control, more of them risk shuttering in the long term. Modern independents like A24 and Neon are able to keep the costs down, whereas the majors like Disney, Paramount, and Universal are spending extravagantly. That can only go on for so long. If things don't change, they risk going the way of many of these companies.